Good morning, everyone. Well, you're very brave to turn out, and I think, as far as I can gather from this morning's news and the emails that are pouring into my phone, this might be the last such event, so let's make it a really memorable one. My name's Emma Bridgewater. I have a decorative role in the CPRE. I'm not an expert in any of the things that we're going to be talking about today, but I believe that this is an incredibly important issue, and it could be a moment whose time is coming. So let's, I think it's going to be a really interesting day. And thank you for inviting me to do this. It's simply lovely to be in Dorset, a county whose breathtaking beauty and deeply romantic atmosphere always takes me by surprise. Surprised even whilst I'm expecting to feel moved as I step back into the landscape of Thomas Hardy's imagination. In fact, I sometimes think that something like the Hebrides, Dorset has such a strange and strong evocative power that it almost amounts to a state of mind. This is a really remarkable landscape. Which is only to say that I know that this county, which dramatically points out to us that standards of housing need to be raised to respond to the beauty of our countryside, and Britain deserves excellent architecture. We're here today to try to find and fix a new determination to create housing which will stand the test of time. We urgently need housing which is useful, fit for purpose, sensibly and sensitively designed, where people can lead happy, productive lives. There are many examples of good, some very good developments, but too often I think we're all of the mind that we see new housing which we know falls short of real human standards. Now, the CPRE is cantering towards its centenary. Nearly 100 years of imaginative and sensitive and forward-thinking conservation has rightly given us quite a big reputation. Sad to say this, but we have taken a stance which is never complete. We can never relax. I think this is the thing that I am sort of catching up with. I'm new to all of this. But what I realise is that many of us who have campaigned feel very, very tired and tested, and in some measure depressed when things, when we've lost our battles as a result of the heroic campaigning. But the CPRE has a very, very strong mantra, which I always feel proud to repeat. What we know we should be getting is the right housing in the right places. We're a pragmatic organisation, practical to the hilt. We want the best solutions. And those aren't always the easiest ones. Yes, we need many new houses. There is a real shortage. But no, we really mustn't put up with weak and lazy versions. And the pressure will always be great to cut corners. So there it is. The campaign is forever. We have to know that. I think, for me, it's that realising that this is a constant battle. And a really worthwhile one is very important. So today we're going to hear from an incredibly impressive and interesting group of people whose working lives have been completely dedicated to what I might call the cause for beauty. Really good housing that really suits and fits into the landscape. There is impressive power and knowledge in the room, and I'm excited about what our speakers will have to tell us. They know tons about how we might prevail and build housing about which we can feel true pride and satisfaction. The principles we're going to see and hear expanded today are the principles we need to see in practice nationally. And I'm just going to finish by saying that, of course, every county deserves really good housing. We all want so badly to find ways to live our best lives in thriving communities. We all have a fundamental right to live beautiful lives in beautiful places. So, I think it's a good principle to move to start just slightly ahead of time. I am a notoriously awful timekeeper. My family would laugh to think that I am directing operations here, but I'm pleased to say I'm already slightly ahead of schedule. And the first speaker is Ben Bolger. Ben is Senior Director at the Prince's Foundation, where some really, really exciting things have been going on. And he's a director of Stockbridge Land. That's a small-scale developer who's really practicing this whole principle of the right housing, thought out in the right way. And that's been going on for long enough for him to have some really, really persuasive detail for us. So that's enough of me. Thank you, Ben.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Emma, and thanks for the invitation. Just quickly, when my title comes up, we looked at the programme and realised that the three Bens here today were all speaking about Poundbury, so we've decided not to do that and instead refer to Poundbury, obviously, as a base, but I'm going to give you a general background, which I hope will then set into context some of the things that come thereafter. So very quickly, it's been interesting. I have been involved for 30-odd years with His Royal Highness's ventures in the built environment, obviously wearing shorts when I started. But it is now 30 years, just a little over, since the Prince released the Vision of Britain. And what I think he was trying to do was to question what we've been building for the best part of the century, or certainly since the Second World War, and say, is there another way? And as you might know, and it is worth sort of reminding ourselves really of these sort of crudely put it into decades, but without a question, those of us that were involved as it first came out, it was complete ridicule. I mean, some actually very rude things being said. It got into a right battle. It became very difficult. I mean, for the next decades, the foundation, we almost went underground, mainly because we were just so busy. But, you know, it was sort of... But I think things seeded themselves in a certain way, a degree of sort of resignation that some of what was being said had a point. The last decade has been really interesting, and I'm going to sort of end, if you like, take you on a sequence through at least what our journey's been like, is there's now recognition that a lot of what's been talked about, and the great thing is nowadays with computers and everything, you can actually look back in time at videos and speeches and documents and realise that it was all there, or has been all there in one shape or form for 30 years. And who knows, you know, if we all start doing beautiful things that actually improve the countryside rather than make the countryside look much worse, then maybe eventually there'll be a degree of respect for what was and still is being very much said. So here's hoping. But just to remind you, I won't dwell on the negatives, but you know, when people are saying an embarrassing, at the turn of the century, an embarrassing anachronism as the new century dawns, there was this whole idea that anything to do with harking back to beauty and Cotswolds villages or Siena or whatever you want was just completely a dream. We don't do that anymore. That's impossible, you know. And as a student at the time up in Edinburgh, I was quite confused by this because I thought, well, why not? We seem to have cars that go faster, and we could do. It just seems bonkers that somehow that everyone seems to just lazily accept that this is the way we do it now, and we're not capable of actually improving things. And it always seemed absurd, and seems more absurd than ever now. But it was weird because it actually a lot of very, very intelligent people believed this narrative. You know, it was all pervasive. It was very much part of the system. And, you know, I sort of, again, make light of this, but this is absolutely what it was. This was the rise, if you remember, 25 years ago, of the Starchitect. You know, you had Rogers's building, Norman Foster doing things all over the world, and this was the great British architects were actually incredibly powerful. And so there was this idea that even on historic buildings, you had to have modernism. You know, if you look at the Venice Charter and all these things, there's a sort of very strange world we'd got ourselves into where we'd all just accepted almost universally through planning authorities, through the middle classes, you know, everyone had just accepted that this is what we do now, that modernism is the way forward, and that looking even remotely back to the past for whatever reason was actually going backwards in time, not forwards, and not progressive. So I think what was interesting here is that our chief executive at the time, David Luntz, and this is again the reason I showed the last slide with Richard Rogers in the cartoon, is Richard Rogers led this task force that actually published its report, the Urban Task Force report, I think it was called Towards an Urban Renaissance, in 99, but it really sunk in, began to take hold in 2000, and from our perspective, we were just merged a group of charities, the Prince's Institute, the Urban Villages Forum at the time, some of you may remember, was quite a powerful developers network. A lot of the stuff that network was doing wasn't terribly, to the Prince's or our standards, but nevertheless, this idea of the walkable neighborhood, suddenly the idea of the mixed-use walkable neighborhood was a thing, the urban village. It was a concept that people could agree on rather than disagree on. And what, to that point, we had found is that there was far too much disagreement from people that were in the same camp, which was rather frustrating. So you couldn't really get a movement started because people couldn't agree on anything. They were always fighting each other. But this funny little diagram, it was incredibly powerful because it talked about this idea of the 500-meter radii, 1 kilometer diameter walkable neighborhood, really the genesis of all urbanism, where the crossroads cross in the middle is where your center is. So this is the idea of a walkable catchment area, roughly 68 hectares, or if you had medium densities, that would look around 1,100 homes, so enough to support, let's say, a primary school. So that became something here, not just in this country, but in America, the new urbanists. There was a Jan Gale, a lot of European urbanism was using these principles. So this was actually quite powerful. And then those of you that remember, I think it was Roland Davis's Urban Design Compendium that came out, and this was Prescott era. He was actually a real champion, actually, of all these principles. And you wouldn't really have thought it, would you? John Prescott sort of sitting next to the Prince of Wales, but there we are. And so as part of that time, and we're talking, goodness, 18 years ago now, certainly, we had an initiative in the foundation called Sustainable Urban Extensions, and it was actually with the government, English Partnerships, now the HCA, and we decided to take 2 pilot projects, one in Basildon, one in Northampton, and we would basically put into practice, or try and put into practice, this idea of planning in a different way. And it was fascinating. I remember the first day we started on this project, and literally there we all were with all the right rules and regulations and mantra and language, and we couldn't even agree on a crossroads. Everything had to be a roundabout. And we thought, well, this is never going to work, is it? We cannot do the things we want to do because all the regulators were there from the council and all the rest of it. So we disappeared into separate rooms, and we drew up our plans and they drew up their plans, and then we had a massive productive fight, and we came out of it working in the same direction. And here's the first 1,100 homes out of a plan for 7,000 to the west side. And it really is an experiment. I wouldn't say it's brilliant, but some very important things happened. One, the idea of proper community engagement, we call it inquiry by design, was run here. The idea of design coding was adopted to make sure that all the parts made a whole. There was some pretty radical things, like every dwelling had to be BREEAM excellent, so very high environmental standards. There were sustainable urban drainage systems threaded through all the streets. There were horse trails there. There was only, again, Prescott days, we were only allowed to have 1.5 car parking spaces per dwelling, which made it very difficult for developers to sell 5-bedroom houses. And my takeaway from this is, meanwhile, Poundbury's rumbling along very nicely, very carefully, not at the time trying to set the bar as high as this, and this kind of fell over, I think. It was just trying to do way too much at once, rather than saying, let's take this for the next 3 years and do it really well, then let's move on to this. It was sort of everything at once, and it was fun, but it was sort of complicated. Anyway, I think it's fair to say it had quite a lot of impact within the industry, because people went to visit it and had a look at it. At a similar time, or shortly after that, we started to work at the foundation with colleagues on a sustainable urban extension to Plymouth. This is called Sherford, and this is where we actually did the master planning work, submitted a master plan for 5,500 homes, so something the size of Totnes, so 3 times the size of Poundbury. And it's now 7,000 as an allocation for a further. So it's massive. Essentially, it's an urban extension, but it's to all intents and purposes a town. And that was a real learning experience, because we didn't have any clue. The promoter had been quite clever. They'd optioned about 15 farms. They'd managed to say to them, look, if you go to the volume house builders, we can't even begin to offer you or agree options with you based on minimum land values of anything like what you'd be offered. But actually, we've got 3,000 objectors. South Hams Against Rural Destruction were quite organised at the time. And do you actually want to see anything or not? So if you sign up to higher standards with the Prince's Foundation via this thing called a design code, then we will do a deal with you on the land, but you won't get as much money now, but you might get more money later. And there was this sort of hope value. Anyway, sadly, and some of you might have seen it in the press, because we fought a bit of a battle after the first 700 homes, which is what you see on the right. That's the small first phase chunk. The volume house builders who took on the site immediately tried to dilute it via Section 73, which that loophole has now been identified and is being closed out. But nevertheless, it's terribly frustrating when you spent more than 2 years of your life writing documents like this that regulates the quality of development to find that it can be ripped up in a couple of weeks. And funnily enough, all the objectors, the 3,000 objectors, I got onto the phone to the main one, Steve Mealy, and I said, Steve, it's terrible, they're going to delete the standards. And he goes, oh, I'm really sorry, but I'm quite busy. I'm now the head of transport at Bristol University. So that's Steve. I won't tell you what I said, but I wasn't that happy. And again, not similar time, Duchy of Cornwall this time, so very different situation. One, you've got a bunch of likely lads at one level, very smart likely lads optioning land with no experience. The other one, you've got the Duchy of Cornwall, almost doing version 2, sort of lessons learned from Poundbury. And this at the time, and we're talking 15 years ago, was the urban expansion of Newquay. So right down, in Cornwall, very remote part of the world, very different values. And the idea was, well, can you apply similar principles there that have been developed and beginning to be delivered at Poundbury? And what was interesting there, we did a very extensive inquiry by design, a lot of intense, it was really quite an intense part of the world. I had farmers with shotgun cartridges being posted through their letterboxes, and it got quite feisty, to put it mildly. I think it was my first inquiry by design, so I was terribly nervous, and it all went really well. And the first question from 300 people in the village hall was, and I won't attempt the Cornish accent, but it was like, did I see you had a mosque? And it was like, well, it's a multi-faith building actually, because we came down here to get away from them, was the first question, at which there was a massive intake of breath. So I thought, oh dear, that didn't go. Then it went really well. Then obviously I went to bed all of Saturday, woke up on Sunday morning to eat my Rice Krispies, front page of the Sunday Times, Prince of Wales proposes mosque in Surfbury. Thank you. So they were the kind of things. But roll on, that was an allocation at the time of sort of 500 to 600 homes, and now it's an allocation, I think, Ben, of about 4,000 homes, and it is very popular. I urge you to go and have a look. It's still much smaller than Poundbury and much younger, but it's very interesting, and maybe others will refer to this as we go on. And the important thing was, we didn't say, how should we respond to an allocation of 500 houses? We asked the question, how should Newquay grow over the next 50 years? And it's a very different way of looking at the world, if you can do that. I'll try not to bore you all with every bit of this, but I put this together the day before yesterday, and it was actually quite cathartic, because it was all of the bits of work that we've been involved with over the last sort of 13 years that we now think have all lined up to have some degree of influence. So from sort of top left, if you like, here, this was, I think, 2007 with Savills. This was when Poundbury was still quite new. 3 developments were looked at and explored in terms of value. And the purpose of the research was basically, does mixed use cost money? And at the time, they were looking at it and said, well, actually, no. So there's a question there, but the idea was that actually the mixed use added value to the housing. Then there was a follow-up report with Knight Frank, SLIM, Strategic Land Investment Model, which drilled into those 3 case studies in a bit more detail. As part of that, back at the foundation, we were starting to look, obviously we're based in Shoreditch in London, the fact that hardly any of our staff could afford to dream of getting on the housing ladder. So we wrote this prospectus called Housing London, a Mid-Rise Solution, and we really started to look at how come some of the most valuable and best parts of London are all 5 to 7 story mansion blocks, and people pay a fortune for them, and they actually have, if you did it right, you could have affordable mixed in with the private. Why can't we build like this anymore? And the answer is because a lot of building regs have made it illegal to build like that. So there was a lot of a challenge as why not. That narrative is going on. We looked back we realized we'd done 110 odd inquiry by designs, probably engaged with well over 10,000 people in communities. So we got on the phone, phoned them up and said, what did you value as a community when we came in to do a planning piece of work with you? So that's quite an interesting document. I should say all of these are on the Prince's Foundation website under resources. And then we looked into estate regeneration. A passion of the Prince of Wales is these post-war housing estates dotted around London. And we worked with Hyde Housing to look at what are the lessons learned and principles of how one takes this very difficult issue of involving and engaging communities in improving their places. This one I will dwell on a bit, or I'll come on to on a couple of slides, because this was a light bulb moment. If you take Sherford and Nansledden, all of the principles were relatively similar. Walkable neighbourhoods, centres, scale, decent edges to the countryside, definition of a town and country, and yet one was being delivered so much more successfully at one level than the other. And everybody beats up volume house builders, but they do what they do very profitably. Everybody beats up members of the local planning authority, but they actually do what they do, and they're incredibly under-resourced at the moment. And yet nobody seemed to be, and probably beating up's the wrong word, but nobody seemed to be lifting the stone on landowners. And I was like, well, hang on a minute. Surely it's the land ownership that makes all the difference, because you've got Duchy of Cornwall there and 3 volume house builders there, and it's a very different discussion. So we wrote this document quite carefully with guidance from 50 people. So it was a broad-based document, and I wouldn't say it's got all the answers in it, but it created a narrative. It's called Building a Legacy, a Landowner's Guide to Popular Development. And it sort of did the rounds, I think, with some of the larger landowners, and it basically posed the question, or stated the fact, a landowner is in control of what gets built on their land until they're not. And that's quite an important thing, because the landowner is the one that will have a knock on the door from whoever it is, an agent or somebody trying to persuade them. They will persuade them, they'll be able to give them more money up front. Obviously, they will then sell that land to the highest bidder, who usually is the one that delivers the lowest quality, and then the land will get developed, and they will not go into the local pub anymore for fear of being spat on. And also they can just hide behind the fact that this is the way development is. I'm sorry, you've seen it all around the country. It's all horrible, but this is not our fault, because we're just the landowner. We've sold our land, and we were told it was going to be beautiful. Well, we really challenged that and said, no, actually the landowner is the one person that could actually make the difference up front between good and bad, but they're not going to do it as a charity. We have to be able to prove to them that it is as at least, if not more, profitable in the long term. And I won't dwell on that, because I know Ben Murphy's going to talk about that. Housing Britain, I'll come on to, was really 30 years after Vision of Britain, restating some of the principles. And then this one, which is on our website, the value of community, is really important, because 13 years after this initial report was done, we got Savills to go back to Fairford Leys and Aylesbury and Poundbury again and look at those projects in much more detail. Again, so building a legacy, as I've mentioned, is really this idea that there is another way. When we had the workshops with all of the many landowners, I was told in no uncertain terms, drop the term legacy, because people will think it's all about the check, it's all about the bottom line. Trustees don't care about legacy, they care about money. And weirdly, it's actually the word legacy that seems to have caught hold. And I'm really glad it has, because if you look at what the Victorians did, the Edwardian, you look at all these, the Georgians, you look at all these periods of great town building, great bridge building, great school making, people seemed to have a degree of civic pride. People seemed to want to not just make money, but make money and leave something behind. So, this quote that I found, the only thing you take with you when you're gone is what you leave behind, is deliberately on the last page, because I think we need to think about that. Everybody needs to make a bit of money to survive, but surely there is more to life than that. If we look at anything that we do as people involved in town building, town making, village, whatever you want, building a house, and when it's finished you look at it and go, I'm embarrassed, then you showe be ashamed, quite frankly. So Housing Britain, I'll just rattle through this. These are when we look back at the Vision of Britain, we thought that it was unintentionally a little bit preachy. There was the sort of 10 principles, a bit like the 10 Commandments, and obviously there wasn't much evidence base other than historical examples. What was brilliant 30 years later is that there were all sorts of people who were actually out there walking the walk. who weren't necessarily even deliberately part of the Prince's Foundation, but were connected to the foundation. So, we were interviewing people like Roger Madlin, ex-Sergeant, now British Land, because Dimitri Porphyrios, who was part of our network, planned Brindley Place and then King's Cross. It's fairly significant landmark projects that were actually taking these principles a step forward. So what we did is wrote it like a magazine, but also talked and interviewed people who'd actually been doing this stuff for 20, 30 years. And I think it's quite powerful. So here we have controlling the land, capturing land value, making public spaces and places, very importantly, building businesses within houses, that's so important, the mixed-use component, designing streets for people, not just cars, something that's incredibly well done at Poundbury. Making popular and beautiful buildings. I'll come on to that in terms of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. And then actually enabling long-term stewardship. I'm hoping John might talk about that. That is another big recommendation in the latest Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, which I'll come on to, and I think one that the government's going to take quite seriously, thank goodness, and so on. I won't bore you with the rest, because again, you can look at it online. But it was 14 principles that we believe are slightly different from the vision of Britain, but very much hold true. The value of community was a very interesting report, and again, you can read it at your leisure, and it's quite detailed, but it takes 2 case studies, which are very interesting, because one, as you probably know, Poundbury, master planned by Leon Creer, designed around 4 walkable neighbourhoods, mixed use at the centres of the neighbourhoods, etc., and it's had all of these statistics, which very impressive statistics Ben will talk about. Similar size development of Fairford Leys, designed or master planned by John Simpson, had a design code, walkable neighbourhoods, so very similar aspirations, but in this case, Ernest Cook Trust and a volume house builder, I think it was Taylor Wimpey who delivered that. So it was actually quite interesting to look at similar projects, similar aspirations, delivered in different ways by different people, and then go and actually drill into that in quite a lot of detail. And what it found, fairly significantly, that not only was Poundbury delivering higher values, and you need to be very careful in terms of talking about what types of value, because it's often misunderstood. You're talking pounds per square foot, per hectare, etc. But nevertheless, with the metrics that Savills looked at, it was delivering significantly higher values than the comparator, which was not just new build sites, it was actually similar houses in Dorchester. So it was even commanding a premium over the nice Georgian Victorian houses in the adjacent town. Interestingly, as many of you will know, there's this sort of rosy new build premium. And I remember somebody once saying to me, a new urbanist, Ray Gindros, saying, well, the thing about building a town versus building a housing estate is, on a housing estate, your first house is your most valuable because you're selling the dream of the countryside. Whereas when you're building a town, your last house is the most valuable because you're actually building a place. And I remember that sort of stuck with me. And so you do get this thing called a new build premium, which varies enormously region to region, but the sheen soon wears off. So you get the premium, as far as I understand, and it tails. What's interesting here is that there's different ways that Poundbury seems to hold its value, because it gets the premium, like the comparator housing estate, but it also retains a premium, as far as we understand. And very interestingly, because there'd been a recession, they were able to go and look, and that's really interesting data in terms of how it performed when there was a recession, compared to adjacent markets. So it is worth a read, far too technical for me, but the bit that I wanted to contribute to it was that everyone talks about quantities. It's all about pounds per square foot value, how much do I get per acre, but we're very bad at valuing qualities, even within government. I think, the first commission I sat on, the Estate Regeneration Commission with Lord Heseltine, he said that this was the first commission that was actually looking into the relationship between quality of place and impact on public sector, things like health, crime. And I thought, blimey, if he's saying that and he's been around the block, then we've got a problem. So it's incredibly, as many of you will know, disconnected. And what drives the agenda is ultimately Treasury, and even beginning to try and get qualities into the equation has to be done in a way that has some kind of metric that people will believe in, which tends to be quantities, sadly. But this 1,000 questionnaires, nearly 900, I think, came back from residents of those two places, and there was a lot of detail and analysis done in terms of what people value by living in those places. And surprise, surprise, the first one is sort of accessibility and walkability. People like the idea that they can get to places, adjacent towns, railway stations, but they can also walk about. So that's very important. People don't generally like to be cut off, unless they're a hermit. Local surroundings, this was very important. This, I think, is really key. If you think about it, lots of people spend an awful lot of money buying a heritage traditional house, but it's awful in terms of maintenance, heating, and all the rest of it. And yet we're not designing, until you see some of the later presentations today, many houses that have the character and sit within their landscape nicely and are of their place, but also have all the mod cons of efficient heating and blah-de-blah-de-blah. So I think there is a gap in the market which is still yet to be exploited. And then this idea of community spirit. If you mix certain things into a community and design public spaces, you engender a stronger sense of local community, and that people value. So again, some quite useful work. This one was interesting. So people tend to think of Policy Exchange as a right-wing think tank. And a guy called Jack Airy, we worked with quite closely. He published a series of essays for about 18 months ago on beauty. A lot of that work was fed into government, successive housing ministers, one a year, and then secretaries of state, 1.5 a year. They actually, surprisingly, did actually take it more seriously, and Generic now seems to be taking it more seriously than his predecessors, thankfully. But and there were some relatively radical things. The last Policy Exchange document that was written before Jack went in as the new special advisor to Boris Johnson was quite radical. It talked about total planning reform, and more on that later. But this report, which we wrote, sort of co-wrote together, or he wrote it, and we fed in the network and ideas, was again a bit of a light bulb moment to me. So we'd been working on all these big settlements. We were, thanks to the Duchy, engaged again on a new site called Faversham in Kent, beautiful historic town. All of the growth has gone to a not-so-beautiful place called Sittingbourne, and the good residents of Faversham realise their time has come. They realise with the Javelin train that they are going to get growth, whether they believe it, like it or not. And so the question is, well, who's going to do it, and where's it going to be, and how's it going to look, essentially? And they'd already written, the Civic Society had already written a document, or the Faversham Society, called More of Faversham, which was basically a sort of characterization of their place, saying, if we're going to have houses, we'd like more of this, please. And so we worked very closely with them, and so far it's been a very positive experience. One day we were asked to go and present to the councillors, and they, I don't know, I don't think it was a mistake, was it, Ben? But the head of planning sent us the presentation that he was giving before we all lined up and went in. And it was pretty interesting because until that point, we'd sort of looked at competing sites, but really the Duchy and the Foundation we're not the sort of people to say, right, here's 5 other people who are all wrestling in competition for these X thousand homes. So we'll spend tons of money on planning lawyers rubbishing, firing arrows at them. That's not the way we work. We tend to focus on what we're doing and try and make it as good as we can. But the way most promoters and developers act is that they're trying to kill the competition as well as promoting their own thing. So I won't name names, but there was some of the usual suspects whose only reputation in life has been to appeal, go for the jugular, get consents, you just have to look at some of their websites, and actually sell it off to the highest bidder, usually with everything built being absolutely horrible. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, this is fascinating. Here you've got the Duchy of Cornwall, who's got by now a pretty good track record and good networks. The Foundation have been quite serious, and it's difficult for both of them to wriggle out of commitments. And here we are up against 2 or 3 other promoters, landowners, developers, etc., who haven't got anything remotely in terms of, in fact, their track record, they have got everything, their track record's awful. And yet we don't seem to be being given a competitive advantage pre-allocation. So these sites aren't allocated yet, and the local plan, it won't be adopted, for a good 18 months. So we're in this kind of weird bubble. And I'm thinking to myself, this has got to be all wrong. I just remember hiring the last member of staff who wasn't a very senior member of staff, and the first thing you look at is their CV. What have they done? If they've only stayed for 6 months in every place, bit suspicious. Oh, here's some references. I'll get on the phone. How were they? Were they any good? It was sort of, that's almost, and then you interview them and you see for yourself. Well, it's quite shocking that when we give someone a housing allocation, which for maybe 10,000 homes, that's the first time when the land value just immediately the uplift in land value goes between not in the local plan and in the local plan. Then obviously when you get planning, it goes up again. And it's sort of like that. And yet the standards by which people are judged at that early stage don't really exist. There is a degree of negotiation, but real scrutiny in terms of people's track records, whether they're serious or not, can you pin them down later on in the day, is not there. And having attempted to move to the other side of the line for a few days a week on the development side, I know how difficult minimum land values, I know how much the deal that you do at the beginning impacts on what you're able to do later down the line. So if I look back to everything we'd done as the foundation over 30 years, I'm completely wasting my breath trying to argue with a volume house builder at detailed design stage about the quality of the housing. They can't. Well, it's not they can't, but they're not going to do it if it costs more money, because their game now is the opposite, is to whittle down the costs. And actually, if you wanted to have those discussions and set standards like, the public realm, you really need to do it as soon as possible. But it is difficult because obviously you need to leave in flexibility. So this is what that report, which is called Building Beautiful Places, was about. We set out, and it's made its way, some of this has made its way into the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission in terms of what we refer to as place standards. And are there some objective and measurable things that one can actually look at that help determine whether you're going to grant someone a housing allocation or not? So on to the Building Better Commission. I was one of a number of advisors over a year's period. The original chair was Sir Roger Scruton, who sadly died a couple of weeks before the report was launched. So to a degree, a lot of the work in here is part of his legacy, because it was a really interesting group of people, I have to be honest, from all different backgrounds. It was pretty intense. There was a little bit of, I wouldn't say it was smooth sailing at the beginning, but nevertheless, everyone stuck together. And what was amazing was the word beauty, which everyone thought, cool, that's a bit risky, was actually weirdly the thing that bound everybody together, and that even the sort of the architects who were a bit sort of chippy about the word beauty, they liked the fact a philosopher was leading on the commission, and they liked the fact that there was this bigger agenda that wasn't just your usual stuff. So it was an interesting thing, and there are the three elements and areas. And this is the way that the commission was broken down. One of the things which refers to what I was talking to earlier is, at the moment, we have an incredibly, unlike some of the European countries, we negotiate planning a lot. It's subjective opinion. So when you've got millions and millions, some of these new towns, you've maybe got £5, £6, £7 million out that could be worth very little if you don't get a consent. So it's incredibly risky business, and a lot of the money is going into the risk, obviously, because gambling cash is a lot more expensive than cash once you've got a consent. So we've got this funny system where an awful lot of money goes into negotiation, interest rates at early stage, all at risk. And is there a way that we can level the playing field to give more certainty and more, and that, I like to think, links to some of the place standards and deals. Communities, this is something I talked about earlier. The government are really hot on making sure that it's not just fake consultation. You go away, do what you want to do, and hire some PR consultants to pin it up on a wall and make it look nice. This is actually starting with a blank sheet of paper and engaging communities in what they want. Stewardship, I think we'll wait and see. The white paper's due out in spring, but I think it'll probably be more like the summer. As far as I understand it, the stewardship model, even a stewardship kite mark, where people who can meet certain criteria might get access to cheaper infrastructure funding. Because at the moment, anybody can pretty much apply and get infrastructure funding. So is there a way of prioritising who gets incentivised? And also there's going to be some scrutiny, and I'll come on to later work from Knight Frank about tax incentives for people to take a long-term view. And that's all about stewardship and patient capital. There's a whole thing about equaling the country out, making sure that there's regeneration as well as new build. neighbourhoods, we talked about very much the idea that we should stop talking about houses and housing numbers, and we should actually start thinking about communities and placemaking. Nature regreening, Kim's talking later, so I won't. And I know you've got certain views. And then this whole idea, there was some quite interesting, and I know it for a fact 30 years ago when I was studying up in Edinburgh, there's a massive disconnect between what architects like and what communities like. And so that was just sort of laid out in the document. And actually it's been taken quite positively by the architectural community. They recognise it and they believe that architects, if architects were more interested in what local communities felt, then maybe house builders would use them more. I don't know, maybe not. But at least there's a chance, rather than just their city centre sites where they want a name to get planning, which is the way it works. You can't read this at all, so don't bother. There were 44 policy recommendations in the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. And and when I looked, I had to provide a briefing to the Prince of Wales the other day, and I went through all of them, and I think about 35 of them were all things that we had, at one stage or another, in those various reports, set out there. So I think it's fair to say we feel that where the agenda is now is very aligned to what we've been banging on about and what he's been banging on for a while. So that's good. The danger is that it, again, is another layer and gets overcomplicated. So we'll see about that. But what we thought is that, if you remember when the National Planning Policy Framework promoted the idea of good design, I did point out to Steve Quartermain that it didn't seem to be defined anywhere. So are you going to make the inspector and the local planning officer, no disrespect to any local planning officers that are here, the arbiters of taste on beauty? Because if you're not careful, that is exactly what's going to happen. So you may have seen the National Design Guide has come out, which I think is one idea. At least you've got something to refer to in terms of what you mean by good design. And you will also have seen that Robert Jenrick has mandated, as a bit of a shoe-in, on the back of the National Design Guide, this thing called the National Design Code. So that's kind of interesting to us. We've got in the commissioned report quite a few things that we've worked on. This is the Building Beauty in My Backyard, the BIMBY Online Toolkit, which is a methodology we've used about how to engage with communities. And it talks quite a lot about form-based codes, form-based coding. This is coming. Jenrick's deadly serious about this. He's got Andy von Bradsky, chief architect, doing it as we speak. I think the deadlines for the commission for that work was the 6th of this month, and it's going to be done in the next couple of months. So every local authority will have a national design code, which is like a template, and then they will have to produce their own they will have to localize that code to influence the quality of new housing. I'm not sure, I'm sure people are aware of it, but I'm not sure how seriously they're taking it at the moment, because this is coming quite quickly over the hills, so to speak. And I know Jenrick's serious, and I know Jack Airy is serious. This is another page. Years ago, we worked with Adam Architecture, Hugh Petter, on a pattern book for Newquay, which is now being adopted, as far as I understand it, across great parts of Cornwall. And this is a slide from the first phase at Tregunwall Hill. And you can probably see things that were in the pattern book, like the boundary treatments, the colours, the simplicity of the architecture. I think it's incredibly successful, and a lot of people who see it just feel, the picture was taken after only a couple of years of it being up, so it's brand new, and already people look at it and say it has a sense of place, it has a sense of quality, and it's not overly fancy. I think people often don't like things that are a bit too ostentatious. They feel that this is maybe a bit calmer. So that was one pattern book and code at work, but with the Duchy of Cornwall. Here's another pattern book and code that was written in coordination with Ben Pentreath here. And this is 3-volume house builders. This is Taylor Wimpey, not Persimmon, Taylor Wimpey, Bovis and Linden. I think Bovis and Linden are now the same thing. And again, we made it simple. They literally photocopied, as we kind of knew they would, the pages out of the document and cut and pasted it. It's a shame that it's 90% there, and it would have been so easy to get to get the last 10% right. But if you look too closely, but it's still pretty impressive when you consider that down the road, not too far down the road at Cranbrook, which was a development that people sort of said is really quite good, the same developers are involved in Sherford as in Cranbrook, and this is what they're building over there. All I would say that people who were worried about writing regulations and writing codes is this: if you leave people to their own devices, so Duchy with a pattern book, big multiples building out to a fairly cookie cutter type thing, but they do volume anyway, so why not? And then you've got unregulated to the degree, well, highly regulated. They still have had to get, someone has given us detailed planning consent, by the way. So I don't know who, but it is just really, it's always good to compare things, I think, and rather than just find faults in that, it's better to say, well, what else is going on? Anyway, I won't labour that point. Form-based codes, keep your eye on it. Fast track for beauty. This is going to be interesting. Local development orders. I don't have a great deal of experience, but I understand that they are being used in Nansedden, Ben. Is that right? LDOs. The government basically believes that if you set regulations early on through form-based codes and standards, given that the industry is volume anyway, and that's what we're trying to regulate, that surely you need to make the path much easier. So once you've got your basic consents and you've adopted the standards, you've adopted the codes, it's essentially permitted development rights, and you can just turn the handle and crank it out. And you don't have to have this subjective one-on-one kind of interview every time you go through. Now, that's fraught with interest and difficulties, but as part of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, there are two significant reports which take not dissimilar format to the Savills one, but have looked at 9 developments across the country and given values and looked at this stewardship model. One of the documents is interesting because it's like a case study of a hypothetical place, and landowners, it would be good to read that because it sort of takes you through all the stages and what it is now and what it could be if we change the rules a little bit. We were hired a year ago by the Ministry of Housing, CLG, to do an exemplar charrette, exemplar inquiry by design, and JTP did one in Devon and we did one in Averley in Thurrock, which is east of Fenchurch Street, 20 minutes, and on the Thames. So that's where the Lower Thames crossing is coming in. Very complicated place, full of HGVs and the like, and very low land values, given that you're into the City of London for 11 quid return in 20 minutes. It's quite an extraordinary place. So we went through this process very quickly. The idea was to take the local authority on a journey. The first thing that we did, and we always do, is listen to the community. So we put lots of charts up, we asked lots of leading questions, just like a doctor, GP does when you go and see them. How do you feel? Tell us about your place. So, of course, HGVs are knocking everybody over, and it's absolutely lethal. School children have to walk down the main road where all the HGVs are coming. There's nowhere for them to cycle and walk. It's a real shame, isn't it? Because we've got grade 1 and grade 2 listed buildings, but all the heritage is being wiped away, and the access to the countryside seems to have disappeared. So taking the top 4 out of what they told us, they're the top 4. The second stage is, like a doctor, going through the GP analogy, it seems a bit pertinent at the moment, is that examination. Regardless of what you've said, you've helped the doctor hone in on what they might want to look for, but you then do an objective analysis. So literally what we do here is this diagram top right, you can see with the isochrones, there's the village, and we literally say, right, bus stops, 300-metre isochrone, primary schools, 500-metre, and we map all of the things, shops, schools, parks, etc., and we just literally put accessibility isochrones rings round them, and then we just simply hatch in where has got the most things. So it's just, all it's showing you is the most accessible land that people have put forward potentially for development. It's incredibly useful. Knight Frank have worked with us. They came to this. Using GIS tools, you could basically do a national plan for England based on accessibility, just using heat maps. There's enough evidence. We just put it in. First, you just call people up and say, your land's been identified by our heat map. Are you in or out? Rather than this sort of competitive call for sites issue. So that was kind of interesting. The next stage then is and this is really important, but you basically just compare the two. So everything about planning is housing numbers, how many houses. You argue about 600 homes generates this many cars. The way we work is completely different. It's like which land is the most accessible and which land can deliver those top 5 priorities. So this land has the opportunity to create a new roundabout to turn back HGVs, because once they've gone this far, they can't turn round because they're in a historic lane. This land has the opportunity to create a secondary route across a new park from the school so that the main school in the village can actually connect to where most people live. This land also has the opportunity to provide expansion land for the school so that as you develop out houses, they can build. This is the grade 1 listed church. There's a grade 2 listed manor farm, the same landowner. So the idea, they're very interested to work with the church to open up a sort of community hub, an area where there's a lot of making, and sort of semi-retired people in AV. Is there somewhere where people can actually come, mums and dads, after school, have a coffee, play in a park, cross the road safely, etc., etc. So I won't dwell on the point, but one of the ladies from Thurrock came up to me, who was one of the planners, and she said, this has just been so eye-opening because this completely turned planning 180 degrees on its head. This is not what planning normally is, and yet it makes sense to local people. The point is, I think, that if you do this sort of thing right, you engage with communities, you listen to them, you accept, and you try and set standards earlier on so that you have the right deal done with a landowner, convince the landowner that this is the right thing to do, and over a number of years they can actually make the same amount of money, then we should all be doing this. Thank you very much.